Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, welcome. He is currently the executive director of the Essentia Foundation, which I'm just sort of learning about, which according to its website, if I might quote, aims at communicating in an accurate yet accessible way the latest analytic and scientific indications that metaphysical materialism is fundamentally flawed, end quote. Dr. Kastrup's philosophical work, in line with this, has sparked a resurgence of interest in what is called in philosophy, quote, metaphysical idealism, which argues for the position that reality is essentially mental. Dr. Kastrup himself holds a PhD in philosophy with a focus on ontology and the philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering, where his research focused in part on artificial intelligence. Dr. Kastrup is also a scientist, having worked for the European Organization for Nuclear Research, otherwise known to us as CERN, and the Phillips Research Laboratories, which is where the so-called Casimir effect of quantum field theory was actually discovered, observed, I guess, for the first time. Dr. Kastrup has also been active in the high-tech industry for almost 30 years, having co-founded the parallel processor company Silicon Hive, which was acquired in 2011 by Intel. He's also worked as a technology strategist for ASML. His work has been featured in many places, including Scientific American, the magazine of the Institute of Art and Ideas, the blog of the American Philosophical Association, something I know something about, and Big Think, among others. Dr. Kastrup's 11th book, coming out in late 2024, is entitled Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, a straightforward summary of the 21st century's only plausible metaphysics. Today, he will discuss with us his thoughts on the so-called Silurian Hypothesis, which many of you probably already know, which a hypothesis regarding the nature and origins of some UAP, a position which Dr. Kastrup regards in the essay as, on balance, one of the most plausible. The focus of our discussions today will be this article where Dr. Kastrup discusses this hypothesis, published in the Debrief. The article was entitled UAPs and Non-Human Intelligence, What is the Most Reasonable Scenario? Thank you, Dr. Kastrup, for being with us. And joining us also for our colloquium are two academics with an abiding interest in the subject. Dr. Kevin Knuth, many of you know, is a professor of physics at the University of Albany, editor-in-chief of the journal Entropy. He's a former NASA research scientist, having worked at NASA Ames for several years in the Intelligent Systems Division, designing artificial intelligence algorithms for astrophysical data analysis. So there's some overlap there with Dr. Kastrup's work. His current research interests include the foundations of physics, quantum information, autonomous robotics, the search for and characterization of extrasolar planets, and of course, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. Dr. Knuth has published many dozens peer-reviewed and scientific articles and has been invited to give many presentations in many countries. Finally, Dr. Michael Glawson is with us, a philosopher working on interdisciplinary issues across the sciences, religion, and ethics. Very broad thinker. He has taught at the universities of South Carolina, Georgia State, and the College of Charleston. He is a contributing member of the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, co-host of the UAP Studies podcast, and regularly lectures on philosophical dimensions of the UAP subject, most recently at Yale University and Vassar College. He lives with his partner and family in Charleston, South Carolina. Welcome, everyone. So the procedure, briefly, Dr. Kastrup will just ask you kind of to give us maybe an overview of your ideas that were in that debrief essay. We'll turn the floor over to our two primary discussants for today, which I'm sure will touch off a lively exchange. And then we can entertain questions from our distinguished audience that has gathered to join us today, after which we will adjourn. So with that, thank you, everyone. Welcome. And I'll hand the floor over to our very distinguished guest for today, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Dr. Kastrup, please.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. You should all call me Bernardo. I feel rather funny when people call me Dr. Kastrup. It's like they're sort of kicking me out of my humanity and creating space between us. I got these degrees because, unfortunately, we live in a society in which these kind of things are sometimes necessary for you to be taken seriously. I think we can all start from the understanding that there is something going on that does not have prosaic explanations. I think at this stage of the game, to not admit to this requires a severe level of unawareness or a bizarre level of prejudice at this point. We don't know what it is that is going on, but it's not swamp gas and meteorological balloons. So there is something that does not have a prosaic explanation. Now, this something may be various different things that we sort of conflate together. And I am keenly aware that there are good reasons to think of the so-called alien abduction phenomenon and the rest of the UAP story that relates more to the military and objective measurements. There are some reasons to put them together because there are certainly some similarities. But I think methodologically, we should take that step only when we have more positive reasons to conflate these two things together, namely the more mind-oriented alien abduction phenomenon and the more objectively measurable UAP phenomenon. Because if we put these two things in the same bag too soon, it makes our challenge in coming up with plausible explanations for the phenomenon, it makes this challenge at least more difficult and perhaps impossible, because whatever hypothesis we put forward has to be then consistent with two phenomena that ultimately may be different things. So we sort of handshackle ourselves unnecessarily. So from this methodological basis, I think for the time being, let us treat them separately. I think the alien abduction phenomenon is something closer to the Jungian hypothesis of a collective unconscious, corresponding to a phylogenetically very ancient layer of the human mind, evolved very early, maybe at the dawn of the genus Homo, almost 3 million years ago. It's a layer of our mind that does not have the ability to articulate things in language because it is too ancient, and therefore it talks to itself symbolically, just like our dreams do. So could there be a collective layer of the human mind that is speaking to us symbolically through metaphor, through mythology, to bring our attention to something, or maybe to dislodge our thinking from local minima, to dislodge our understanding of the world from local minima in which we have got stuck. So that's one hypothesis. And if we set then that alien abduction part aside, what we are left with is a phenomenon that can be objectively measured. It can be captured in radar traces, can be photographed, its energy output can be measured, it can leave footprints, can leave physical traces behind. In other words, it seems to be a little bit further away from the purely subjective, symbolic, high strangeness side of the equation, which may be that phenomenon related to the collective unconscious. So what is this then, this UAP part, this objective part? I entertain, honestly, many hypotheses in my mind. Some of these hypotheses quite far out. I think it's a valid part of the intellectual process to entertain hypotheses. But I think we have to guard against running away with a hypothesis that requires too many conceptual steps and maybe too many theoretical entities. It requires postulating too many things. So the exercise I tried to do in the article, in the debrief, was the following. Can we come up with a hypothesis that does not require any element, any building block that we don't already know to exist, and still come up with a hypothesis that, at least in principle, can account for the UAP phenomenon without postulating, new dimensions or a completely new metaphysics, which, as it so happens, is what I do in the rest of my life. I postulate idealism as a metaphysics. But can we stay even metaphysics neutral in postulating a hypothesis to account for the phenomenon? Can we stay away from those waters? That was my exercise. And the article is what I came up with. There is nothing in the article, in the debrief, no element, no building block of it that we don't already know to exist, to be possible, and to exist. So the idea is the following. If you look at the literature, especially the work of Jacques Vallée, others as well now, there are many good ones now working on this field, many good people. But what you see there in the statistical analysis of the phenomenon are characteristics that are not consistent with UAPs being of extraterrestrial origin. Jacques calculated that in a period of 20 years, there were 3 million visitations. You don't need 3 million visitations to do a complete survey of a planet and its living inhabitants. Instead, if you come across these things so often, 150,000 times a year, what this suggests is that whoever is controlling the UAPs are from here, and we are just bumping into them, and they into us, just like we bump into a wild bear on a trail. As a matter of fact, to bump into them 150,000 times a year is much more frequently than we bump into many rare animal and plant species. So it's not even very rare. The other characteristic is that they seem to be invested in the habitability of the planet. They seem to show interest in human activity that can potentially cause harm to the habitability of the planet. So they are interested in nuclear installations, military exercises. That too is a characteristic that you would expect from an agency or an intelligence that is from here and doesn't want to lose their home. It's not consistent necessarily with the crew of Star Trek coming have a look and sticking to the prime directive. They seem to be too invested in the future habitability of this planet, which goes along with their being from this planet. So if we then assume this, let's assume they are from here. How can we account then for their behavior, their clear head start on us in terms of technological development? They don't seem to be constrained by the laws of physics, the law of inertia. They don't seem even to displace air or water. They seem to live in a sort of a bubble in which our laws of physics do not apply. How do we account for that? And how do we account also for the fact that there clearly aren't abundant signs of their presence in this planet, other than the 150,000 times a year that we can bump into them? We don't see their cities around. We don't see their ruins. We don't see their factories. We don't see their pollution output. So what's going on? If they are from here, why don't we see them? The hypothesis I came up with was that these are intelligences that evolved on this planet. We know intelligent species that create civilizations can evolve on this planet because we are one of them. So this is not a new element. We know intelligent species can evolve on Earth. We did, so another one might have done as well. And then what people immediately ask is, well, if so, why don't we see their ruins? If they evolved here and they sort of almost went extinct, because clearly we don't see them around at will, we don't see their cities, so they might have gone largely extinct. So why don't we see the ruins of their civilization? Why don't we see the mines they dug up? Why don't we see the wells they drilled to extract hydrocarbons? To understand this, we have to look past this relative naivete we have that that we can see signs of everything that has ever happened on this planet. Geologically, that is not at all the case. Um, the ocean's crust, bottom of the ocean, which is 2/3 of the surface of the planet, recycles itself every few dozens of million years. What is today the ocean crust will sort of plunge into the mantle of the Earth and will be completely reforged and re-emerge in new volcanic activity. So every few dozens of millions of years, we have a completely new, clean slate as far as the ocean floors are concerned, which is 2/3 of the surface of this planet. We have this geological recycling of the crust very fast and complete in the case of the bottom of the oceans. The continental crust is different because it sort of floats on top. So it's not recycled as fast. There are small parts of the continental crust exposed today that were exposed 2 billion years ago. That's why we find minerals and rocks and some very ancient fossils from 2 billion years ago. But it's a relatively small area around Greenland. Even the continental crust, given a longer period of time, also recycles itself. And once that recycling happens, there is absolutely nothing left of whatever industrial activity might have taken place before. No vestige of it will be left. As far as surface features on the crust, like ancient ruins and logistical and transport infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, atmospheric erosion alone would completely decimate it after only a few million years. The reason I appeal to this geological recycling of the crust is that other things wouldn't disappear that fast, like mine shafts, but they would disappear with crust recycling. Nothing would be left. It's a complete reforging of the surface. Now, if, say, after a couple of 100 million years, nothing is left from an industrial civilization, how much opportunity does that give us to hypothesize previous civilizations? Well, the answer is a lot. Life has been on this planet for 4 billion years. Most of the life we know today came up only 500 million years ago around the Cambrian explosion. So you have 4 billion years in which things could have happened. And even if you think that no civilization could have arisen and developed without hydrocarbons, then we still have the 350 million years since the Carboniferous, because we know that oil, hydrocarbons, has been available since then. That gives us plenty of time for species and entire civilizations to have arisen, developed, and come to an end. Because civilizations can arise, develop, and come to an end in only a few thousand years, which is the blink of an eye. It's a mayfly life, it's nothing. So theoretically, hypothetically, there could have been quite a few intelligent civilizations on this planet evolved on Earth, either from the same abiogenesis event that started out our tree of life or another one, and that could have developed and almost disappeared without a trace. Civilizations on the surface of a planet are fragile. The surface is a very volatile place. Weather is one. Irradiation is another, from solar storms or supernovae that can irradiate the surface of the planet. Impact, asteroid and comet impact, we know those happen. The dinosaurs have learned a thing or two about those. Wide temperature fluctuations. If you look at temperature fluctuations at the bottom of the ocean or underground, there's very little. Underground, deep underground, it's very hot, but there aren't fluctuations. The bottom of the ocean, it's cold, not very cold. Water cannot go below -4, at best under optimal conditions. So not very cold, but stable. So if there was a advanced terrestrial civilization at an industrial level, and that civilization came to an end because of a planetary cataclysm countless millions of years ago, it stands to reason that remnants of that civilization, and if they had miniaturized technology like we are developing, 3D printing and portable nuclear reactors, if they had that, only a few remaining survivors of the planetary cataclysm could have kept the technology and the civilization going at a very small scale. If planetary cataclysm affected us tomorrow, probably some of us would survive. Our industrial infrastructure is still too much large scale. It's not miniaturized enough for us to do perhaps what they did. But we too would survive with some of our technology. So it stands to reason that that could have happened to them. What would they have done then, these survivors, these remnants? Well, if it was a planetary cataclysm on the surface of the planet, that would cause a generational trauma, and they would go under, either under the oceans or underground, because it's a much less risky, volatile environment where temperatures are constant. You don't have the weather destroying your agriculture. You are protected to some extent from planetary impact. So the hypothesis here is that maybe the UAPs are whatever remnant technology there is of a earlier terrestrial intelligent civilization at an industrial level that suffered a planetary cataclysm, and have gone under, because that's what any intelligent species would do after the trauma of a planetary cataclysm. And if that is the case, then they are as invested as we are in the habitability of this planet. And we bump on them when they are going around their business, because you cannot stay in a hole all the time. You have to come out for, I don't know, getting rid of pollution, or finding raw materials, or checking what the monkeys are doing on the roof, because the monkeys are clearly going haywire, and they discovered nuclear energy. Goodness knows, that we could leave the monkeys alone on the roof until 1945, but after that, better keep an eye on the monkeys. And none of this requires any leap of faith as far as the building blocks are concerned. The weak point of this hypothesis is that we don't have direct evidence for it other than UAPs. And what you'd like to have is a second leg, a two-pronged line of evidence that converges to the same hypothesis. We don't have a second line of evidence. We haven't found holes down in the ocean that we could have gone in and check who is living down there. We haven't found, for very good reasons, any fossilized remains of a very ancient non-human civilization. So we lack positive evidence for it, but we have no reason to discard this possibility, because, again, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. There are excellent reasons why we wouldn't, in any case, have fossil record evidence of such an ancient civilization, for the reasons I discussed with you. So is this what I personally believe? Let me try to answer my own question in a way that doesn't hurt me. In my heart of hearts, I think things are more complicated than this. But methodologically speaking, I think we owe it to ourselves to take one careful step at a time. And I think the hypothesis I just described is the most conservative, cautious, and guarded that could still, in principle, account for the phenomenon. And I think we are then methodologically obliged to look at it first before we start extrapolating the data too much. But in my heart of hearts, I think things are a little more complex than this. Maybe an ancient terrestrial civilization, or maybe multiple, are part of the story, but perhaps there is more to the story. I don't know. We can talk about it, but this is my introduction. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you, Bernardo. Bernardo, I just want to say how appreciative I personally am, and I think I can speak for many of my colleagues here, just the care with which you're approaching this question, and the level of methodological meta-awareness you have about proceeding here in such a fraught sort of subject, you know, historically. And I'm just sort of very deeply impressed by your intellectual integrity and your approach to this question, and you know, trying to advance our thinking forward in a rational, you know, considered, thoughtful way. So I just wanted to thank you very much for that.
Thank you, sir.
I really appreciate that. Now let's see if we disagree anywhere. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to our discussants. Thank you again. Kevin and Michael, please,
Yeah,
you know, please take it away.
I would like to second Michael's appreciation, and yeah, this is really a welcome essay, because you've taken the topic and elevated it to the level that we need to be at.
Thank you, Kevin.
We've spent so much time, so many years, arguing over whether these things are real or not, which is really just ridiculous at this point. And you're absolutely right, to not appreciate that there is not a prosaic explanation really betrays either some amazing amount of ignorance or some pathological, you know, avoidance of the topic. And so I think you're absolutely right about that. And so I thank you for thinking carefully about this and elevating the discussion. I think that's wonderful.
Thanks, Kevin.
Agreed. I just want to say, I don't know which one of us is going to go first with our actual comments, but I want to say I just am so appreciative of the way you've taken so many various lines of evidence and sort of theoretical considerations and woven them together into kind of a synoptic consideration of this question, which is what somebody needed to do, because anytime anybody tries to engage with this question, there's so many strands of what ifs that you can use to derail the central question about whether there's a thing here that we need to even bother theorizing about. And so we were all just too lazy or incompetent to do it. But you have the, you know, I think it takes 2 PhDs maybe to do something like that.
No, sir. but thank you.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, great job.
Thank you.
Which of us should go first, Kevin?
You may go first. You can.
Okay, sure.
Please. Yes.
I'll do it. So I hate when people read their comments, but I'm going to excuse myself from my own preferences here, because I'm trying to pack a lot of what are to me kind of subtle thoughts into one general comment up front, and then I can give a few more. But the one that I really want to hear your thoughts about are this. So Dr. Kastrup discusses a wide array of phenomena, and he lays out several different theories in addition to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and discusses how they might explain various UAP evidence using the same standards and norms of reasoning that define scientific disciplines like physics and biology. This sort of work is absolutely necessary if UAP studies is to mature into a coherent discipline ever. I often wonder, though, whether standard modes of scientific reasoning are adequate for studying these phenomena. One reason is this. A hallmark of UAP is that they consistently seem to indicate an intelligence on the other side of the phenomena. Specifically, their behavior and often their physical form seems to indicate intentionality, the acquisition and use of knowledge, and calculative decision-making. Taken together, these are sufficient for what we might just call strategic action, which we plausibly see exhibited in simple ways by UAP when they do things like attempt to evade collision or pursuit. If there is an intelligence on the other side of these phenomena, though, making strategic decisions according to an unknown set of aims and using an unknown set of capabilities and resources, we're in a very different position when we try to theorize an explanation for these phenomena than when we theorize explanations from phenomena in physics or cell biology, the sort of disciplines that we're trying to raise UAP studies to the same level as. And this is one reason why I wonder if the same general modes of reasoning that define those disciplines are sufficient for the study of UAP. As far as we know, atoms can't intend to do anything at all. They don't acquire knowledge and use it to strategize in the pursuit of aims. We don't have to worry that they'll strategically attempt to deceive us when we study them or try to guide our attempts to theorize about them. It's just not in the realm of possibility. It seems at least possible that the situation is quite different when it comes to our attempts to study UAP and to theorize about whatever is behind the phenomena that we do perceive. I'd be interested to know how Drs. Kastrup, Knuth, and Safoni, and the members of the audience think this possibility should inform the general way we not only study UAP, i.e. collect data and analyze them, but how we theorize about explanations for their behavior or about their fundamental nature, i.e. whatever is behind the phenomena that we can study empirically. How do you theorize about the nature of a phenomenon that might have the ability, means, and incentive to affect your attempt to theorize about them? We could express the same concern, but frame it differently in this way. If there's an intelligence behind the phenomena, and it makes choices about how it thinks we experience it, then we have to acknowledge that these phenomena are to some degree, some unknown degree, theater. In addition to whatever else they are, they're performances, calculated and enacted for some set of aims that are opaque to us. Though we know very little about those aims, we do know that among them lie some preferences about how we understand, theorize about, and investigate the phenomena to determine what is behind them. Some elements of UAP's presentation must be a function of these calculative preferences, but we don't know how many or which elements. Imagine this were the case with cell biology. We learned that cells are some deeper biological element of ontology, knows that we're studying it, and that biological phenomena are not merely a function of physical and Darwinian principles, but are to some degree calculated according to hidden aims and preferences that must include preferences about how we study them and which conclusions we draw about them. How would the biological sciences need to change? This, I think, might be the situation that we're in. Dr. Kastrup.
Please call me Bernardo.
Bernardo, sorry, yeah.
I understand the question fully. I think it is an important question and touches on a very important point. The simple answer is, if we are dealing with a significantly more advanced intelligence and associated technology, the simple answer is there's very little we can do. Imagine if we could send a Apple iPhone latest generation back in time and make it land on the table of the great Goethe in the 1820s, in 1824, only 200 years ago. And the great Goethe would then bring up a team from the University of Vienna with all the greatest thinkers of his time, and they would try to figure it out. Would they stand a chance? No, because there are some fundamental things about the nature and behavior of reality that an iPhone makes use of. For instance, the notion of fields, which was not there in 1824. It would come up only in the 1830s. Without that deeper understanding of the behavior of nature and the theoretical entities we use to predict the behavior of nature, they would not have stood a chance. And that is only humans to humans with a distance in time of 200 years. So if we are talking here about a terrestrial intelligence with a difference, so not even human, and a difference in time of tens of millions of years, then no, we don't stand a chance. But what is the alternative? The alternative is to roll up in a fetal position in a corner and wait for the revelation. And psychologically, we would not do that. So you might as well apply the best methodologies we have. I think the psychology of the NHI, I think it's largely and fundamentally beyond our grasp. It's a futile effort. I don't think even their logic is Aristotelian logic at all. Why would it be? No, but logic is always based on axioms. Aristotelian logic, 5 axioms. And axioms are things that we believe in because they look self-evident to us, but there is zero substantiation. You cannot logically argue for the validity of logic without circular reasoning. So they wouldn't even have that. Their cognitive system would be completely different from ours. Why would it be anywhere near monkeys? They would have a completely different cognitive system. So no, I don't think we can really hope to grasp their intentions unless those intentions are revealed to us by them. But I think we can hypothesize about their origins and nature. At least we can exclude hypotheses. We can probably say what they aren't. And that goes a long way, in the history of science. Eliminating possibilities has gone a long way in helping us figure things out. So yes, we are monkeys trying to understand what, from our perspective, is at the level of a divinity. But we are not psychologically capable of giving up. So we might as well do our best. Let me see if I want to say a little more about it, but
please do. Yeah. But to wring as much out of it as possible.
Okay. If we grant ourselves a little bit more methodological latitude, because what I spoke of today it's a quite conservative hypothesis. It was meant to not use any building block that we don't know exists or can exist. But if we give ourselves a little bit more latitude and open our minds and try to appreciate intuitively what the phenomenon seems to indicate. I'll give you one example. And remember, I'm not going to stand by this example as a hypothesis I am defending. I'm just allowing myself to go loose a little bit in order to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. That UAPs seem to completely disregard the constraints and regularities we call the laws of physics. They seem to be utterly unaffected by it. They don't show any sign of inertia, absolute control of space-time, even control of our own mental processes. This kind of absolute level of control that goes against the rules of the game. Imagine that our reality, our physical reality, is a kind of game, and its regularities are the rules of the game. It's a metaphor. They come into the board where the game is being played, and by completely ignoring the rules of the game. Do we have any other example where something like this happens? Yes, we do. If you program a game on your computer, and you program its physics, and you program the rules according to which the characters and the players in the game are going to behave, you as the programmer can hack into it and completely ignore all the rules because you have control over the code. What does it tell us about what this thing might be? This is a deep rabbit hole that I'm not prepared to pursue in writing. I'm only prepared to mention here. But what I'm trying to suggest is that if we take a step back and just take in what the phenomenon seems to be showing, with some degree of mental discipline, I think we can formulate some fair hypothesis about what it might be or what it probably is not. And that already helps us. But ultimately, I think it's under their control. Whatever will happen, it's up to them. And what the relationship is between we and them, that's a very, very open question. I think more open than our normal assumptions would allow us to entertain.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might add a little bit of a practical comment that not as deeply thought as what Bernardo just provided, but I think what your question highlight is the fact that we really need to have a multidisciplinary approach. We need to up our game in understanding physics, and I say that as a physicist, but the fact that we're dealing with something that's clearly intelligent and in a different, potentially very different intelligence means that we have to up our game in psychology and sociology and anthropology. And those fields are important too. And so I think that, and that's one thing that I appreciate what I've been seeing in the newly formed organizations like SUAPs here, where we've got people from multiple fields are basically banding together to try to tackle this problem. I think that's exactly what needs to happen.
Yeah, Jacques once wrote, I forgot in which book, Jacques Vallée, he said, We may not be able to figure out what it is, but at least we can look at the effects of what they do. And that may give us a hint as far as what they are trying to accomplish. Presuming that they are making progress, we can look at the effects, and then the effects are what they are trying to accomplish. What has the effect been? And that's the whole story of the control system that he was talking about. So yes, I agree with you. Through a multidisciplinary approach, we can at least come up with a reasonable hypothesis to entertain and exclude some other hypotheses.
I think the heart of my question is how, as we're doing that, and I agree, I think a multidisciplinary approach that incorporates not only empirical sort of observations and theorizing, but all these other sort of less empirical sort of frameworks of thinking, that's exactly what we need. But how do we ever distinguish when, as we're theorizing and getting close to what we think is the best explanatory sort of framework for understanding all this, how do we distinguish between, how do we know whether we're being guided toward the most accurate explanation, or whether we're simply being guided towards the explanation that the phenomenon prefers us to choose?
Well, I think it's the latter. It is almost inevitable that it will be the latter. If we are being guided, then our efforts will be guided towards what they want us to think.
Right, and but that's a huge difference between scientific. I mean, that means that UAP studies will never be on the same sort of plane as sort of cell biology or fundamental physics or something. We'll only ever be able to get to what the phenomena sort of prefers us to think about it.
Well, look at what you just did. You raised this question. Even by raising this question, you're already taking a sort of a meta step out of the system they might have enveloped us with. And you're questioning, maybe maybe what we see is what they want to see. So that meta step is already something. So it's not entirely hopeless, because people like you take a step back and raise this kind of hypothesis. And it becomes a sort of a strategic dialogue based on behavior. It's like a poker game. You're trying to guess what your opponent is thinking and is going to do, or chess, except that in chess, the pieces are all visible, and in this case, they are not. So it is not hopeless, not least because of what you just did, Michael.
Well, I've saved UAP study. They're actually paying me to raise this question, so this is back in the circle. Thank you.
But if I could just jump in a sec, I mean, we have to be, I guess, careful there, but and thinking about how much absolute control or power we grant or are willing to countenance for the UAP, the intelligence, because if we give them sort of at least more knowledge and power and control over the game than we ourselves are able to have, then in a sense we're always faced with the Cartesian evil genius problem, right? We know where that goes. There is no way, right, to absolutely check the checking of the system such that one knows exactly what is the case and what is true and what is false. So you end up in this problem of sort of radical skepticism again, weirdly enough. So I guess we have to kind of be careful about how much superiority or whatever it is that we want to grant, and that's something I think to think about, is this question of how far advanced is the potential intelligence behind UAP, and how do we think about that? Because there's a kind of a hierarchy here with the UAP above us in some sense, but maybe it's not like that. I mean, maybe it's more lateral, right? Maybe they have a different structure of intelligence than we have, and they have a different understanding of how the pieces fit together than we have, and how we understand the pieces fit together, and the ways in which they understand how the pieces fit together enable them to produce technologies and do things that we can't conceive of, but the fact that we can't conceive of them doesn't necessarily imply some kind of hierarchically superior intelligence in such a way that we can't, that they're controlling the game, as it were. Maybe we're equal players, in some sense there. But I just wanted to kind of sort of question the sort of the arrangement there and how we're thinking, and thinking about that. Also, another thing that occurred to me is, again, kind of critiquing the notion of superiority and advancement. Is it really, because the assumption in the discussion is that their technologies, because the technologies that are on display are the result of a long-standing, millions years old civilization, that because of that temporal depth, that contributes to the sort of incomprehensibility or difficulty of our understanding either the intelligence, technological artifacts that we see on display. But is that really the case? I mean, there's a sense in which the combustion engine is kind of requires temporal depth of understanding the human use and engagement with fire, and that's many thousands there. But is it a sort of is the combustion engine as a technological object does that somehow sort of concentrate the entire history and temporal depth of human evolutionary and conceptual intellectual development? It's not so clear to me. Like, for example, look at the nuclear technology. Is that cumulative? I mean, that was a sort of a discovery that was made, and we sort of went from A to B. I mean, from understanding the relationship between matter and energy and understanding the inner nature of the atom. Once we had the concept of the atom, okay, and then we have, the technology of a nuclear reactor, but, in some sense, there's just a small amount of historical development that's sort of implicated there. So I just wanted to sort of throw that in there in terms of thinking about UAP, at least as a technological object. And that leads me to my answer to your question, Michael, which is that I think, the strategy of explanation should be divide and conquer, right? I mean, and what is unique here, I think, is that never before in the history, of science, do we have before us, potentially, at least as the most plausible explanation that we're thinking through here, a technological artifact produced by a civilization either equally or in some sense with a greater intelligence or more advancement in terms of knowing the rules of the game than we possess, right? I mean, that's, this is the unique thing, that it's a technological potentially a technological artifact that we're studying by an advanced civilization, a technologically capable civilization. That's never, right? I mean, aside from human beings and maybe some other tool-using species, there's no example of that. So, but it seems simple, right? I mean, all you have to do is divide and conquer. So the object itself is capable of certain, physical, physical capabilities. I mean, like, kinematics, motion, and so that's a physics problem. Then there's the object as a technological artifact, which is presumably inscribed within a culture. And there's, a certain symbolic field there. So there's a kind of analog to anthropology. And then there's an intelligence behind that. And that would be a problem in the sciences of mind, of psychology, and so on. And then presumably there would be a biology associated with that, right? On the assumption that, that consciousness is corresponding to some biological manifestation in some sense. So there would be implied some kind of, life sciences problem. So it seems to me that, at least, at first approach to the problem, it's easy, divide and conquer. But the question that I wanted to ask is, and this is for Bernardo, as you divide the landscape of these problems into the sort of the abduction stuff and the UAP stuff as an objective presentation in the world, do you think that there are any phenomena that can't be easily so divided such that the objective and the subjective in the phenomena itself is implicated in ways that don't allow us to divide this, which gives us a kind of a unique object where the interdisciplinarity is not just pragmatic, but it's in fact profound, and it's necessary that each of us in physics, in engineering and technology and mathematics, that we exit our field and actually form a field around these phenomena, which we refuse to be divided in that way. So Bernardo, yeah.
I think the difficulty in doing that is the availability of data. Even the data that might be available to humans is so enormously compartmentalized that we can't bring the entire capability of humans to understand things to bear, since it's it's hidden away and unavailable to only a small group of people who may not be necessarily the best people to figure out what's going on, and maybe even for understandable reasons. I think that's the greatest challenge. It's the systematic availability of data. Otherwise, we are just fantasizing and speculating. I understand your earlier point. Could there be a parallel line of development? Yes, but given a different way to relate to reality. We relate to reality in physicalist terms. We sort of say the world out there is fundamentally distinct from mind stuff, and therefore I can objectively observe it without interfering with it, because my mind is in here and the stuff I'm observing is out there. That's the perspective we've adopted since Galileo. Given this tunnel vision, this particular tunnel vision of ours, I think there is a natural sequence to things. If you're talking about releasing energy, you will almost inevitably first release the energy in molecular bonds. And after that, you may release the energy through fission, nuclear fission. And only after that will you release energy through fusion. But given a different reality tunnel, a different way to regard reality, then you could have a completely parallel development that doesn't follow the same steps. In particular, as you guys know, I am an idealist. I think there is an external world. It's real, it's out there, but it's made of mental states, just like our inner life is made of mental states. If that is their understanding, then the difference between technology and psychology vanishes. They do not have that artificially imposed wall, that division of disciplines. Now psychology is a technology. Learning to mentally interface with the world, perhaps across whatever natural dissociative boundaries are there, is a form of technology that may bypass some of the regularities that we call physics. Let me give you a concrete example of this with a metaphor. If the world is made of mental states, and what we call physical states are just representations of those mental states that arise from measurement, just like an airplane with a dashboard. Dashboard indications are representations of the state of the sky outside the airplane that arise when you measure the states of the sky. The way you represent your measurement results is through dashboard indications. I believe that what we call the physical world are dashboard indications. It's what arises on the screen of perception, our internal dashboard, upon a measurement of the states of the world. And the states of the world are mental and not physical. Physicality is the dashboard. Now, our entire story about how nature behaves is based on finding correlations between the movements of different dials on the dashboard. And we call it causality. So to go back to the metaphor, imagine that you are in an airplane and you have a sensor that measures air humidity and another sensor that measures air pressure. And then air humidity is a little dial on your dashboard, an analog dial, and air pressure is another dial on the other side. you will observe that every time air pressure reduces, a little while later, air humidity increases. That's how the weather works. So you will see that the little needle in the dial of air pressure will go down, and a little while later, the needle of the other gauge of air humidity will go up. And they will always behave like this. First one goes down, then the other one goes up. And what we'll say is that the gauge of air pressure causes the movement of the gauge of air humidity. Is that what's happening? No, no, both are correlated, but they are correlated because they are both caused by external states. One dashboard dial doesn't cause the other to move. But that's the mistake we make when we say one physical process here leads to a physical cause there. We are just observing the correlations between the dials. And this works. A pilot can fly an airplane only looking at the dials, doesn't need to have a transparent windscreen to see the sky as it is. All you need is the representations that arise on your dashboard. But it is limiting because it limits your understanding to a sort of rarefied, more or less cartoonish representation of what's actually going on. A dashboard does not capture the full dynamics of the states of the sky. It's a sort of a digest of it that focuses on what is immediately relevant to what? To our survival, because that's why our dashboard evolved. Our cognitive perceptual system has evolved to pick out what has survival bearing for us and ignore all the rest. Neuroscience is getting to this conclusion as well now. If they understood this, then they are not going to artificially limit themselves to this caricatural story of one dial causing the other. They will look behind the dashboard, and that will immediately expose them to many, many more degrees of freedom, and therefore degrees of potential manipulation of reality than we grant ourselves. Why? Because we think the dashboard is the sky. That's what we think. We are pilots that were born and grew up in an airplane cockpit without windows. All we have is the dashboard. We take it for the world. And therefore, whatever limitations are built into the dashboard, we take them to be the limitations of the world. If they have understood that the dashboard is just a representation of many more degrees of freedom, and they found a way to hack through it, then of course they will be able to do things that are beyond us. And in that sense, even if it is a parallel reality tunnel, parallel to ours because of a different way to understand the nature of reality, even in that case, one could still say, look, they do things we can't. And the other way around doesn't seem to be the case. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do that they can't. And in that particular sense, one could say they are ahead of us, even if they are in a parallel line. From this operational perspective, what can they do that we can't, or the other way around? They can be said, in this sense, to be ahead of us, I think.
If I can sneak in one more question and then turn it over to Kevin, this is a shorter one. So you want to, your article takes a very circumscribed approach where you want to talk about, or you want to at least focus on the objective phenomena that we, I mean, use that term, I know, in a very like sort of loose way. I'm not going to nail you down to the distinction, but the distinction you draw is not between objective and subjective, but between like objective and like high strange phenomena that we don't really, we're going to kind of set it on the, not off the table, but scooch it to the side and talk about these things. I'm wondering how we can even draw that distinction in principle in it, other than instrumentally, in that like we have a set of instruments that can detect things like velocity and, you know, mass or something like that, but we don't have a set of instruments that can detect these other things that we might call high strange. Is that generally how you see those two distinctions, or is there some other way that you're doing it? And if so, do we just need new instruments, or do we need to just give up instrumentalism in the end?
I think it is an operational distinction. I think you're correct. It is not a fundamental distinction because there is no basis to make a fundamental distinction. We don't have enough understanding of what's going on even to do that. It's an operational distinction in the sense that in one case, There seem to be consistent measurements done via instrumentation, and there seems to be consensus of observation, meaning multiple people report the same story without inconsistencies and without entailing altered states of consciousness like sleep or trance. And in the high strangeness case, statistically speaking, I think, and I'm not a specialist, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general, they tend to be more personal experiences. And they are not, by and large, accompanied by objective measurements made under controlled conditions. There may be physical traces associated with the experience, but they tend to be ambiguous and be amenable to a variety of different explanations. So that's the distinction I drew, and it's a merely operational distinction. I think if Jacques were here, he would immediately say, yes, Bernardo, but even in the cases where we do have measurements, there's plenty of evidence that these things seem to be able to manipulate our own mentation, our own perception, our mental processes, our feelings, our understanding of what's going on. And in that sense, there is a commonality between these two classes of phenomenon. They both seem to have a lot to do with mind mentation. So I am, as I said in the very beginning, I sort of voluntarily conceded that in the beginning. There are reasons to think that it is not two different classes of phenomena. It's one. My point, however, is that operationally we can draw a distinction, and methodologically we should draw that distinction for now, until we are in a better position to have positive evidence that they are both the same thing, and account, at least to ourselves, why, although they are both the same thing, they seem to manifest in these operationally different ways.
Thank you. Maybe I'll turn it over to Kevin now.
All right. Well, yeah, Michael Safon, how do you want to handle the raised hands in the? We have.
Well, Kevin,
hands up, so.
if you wanted to, I know Michael sort of gave a few extended questions to Bernardo. If you want to do the same, we can do that. Otherwise, we could move over to the queue.
Maybe we'll take these three hands that are up now, and then I can ask some questions.
Okay.
So I think that Mark Hurwood is the first one
Okay.
here.
Okay, thanks. This is very interesting, guys. So it seems to me that a little bit we're not only trying to hypothesize the overall subject, but we're sort of hypothesizing the reasoning by which we come to hypothesize the subject. So just a couple just to throw out, because I'd like to introduce what I need a little bit more clarity about certain things. So one would be, if these beings, we'll just call them beings for now, live here and did not come from elsewhere, and have, as Bernardo, as you allude, powers over matter and time that we can maybe think about, but we can't really conceive of because it's just too far ahead of us. Two things. One, why would they be bound to this planet anymore? Number one. And number two, if they are bound or for whatever reason attached to this planet, and they're aware that of some of the destruction that these monkeys are doing, not only to ourselves, but to the planet itself and species, it's the ocean, etc., they would have no problem taking a few simple actions to ameliorate some of the things we've done. And also, if it's true that, and I'm not saying it's not, that the mind, I'm going to call it mind because I think I'll just call it mind, is part of their purview to reality, then they would have no problem either hiding themselves or revealing themselves in the course of doing what they think would be good for the life of the planet. It seems inconsistent to me that they'd have that kind of power over both mind and matter and time and everything, and yet act sort of like as we would if we were hiding underground and didn't want to be found out. Those two things don't really match up for me. And one last thing, just whenever you get around to addressing it, I think it might well be true that their relationship to knowledge and reason and understanding and wisdom and what this even is, what's behind the dashboard, as you said, might well be the case. But to me, that doesn't extend to logic itself. It just means that what they have to consider logically is a sort of a higher dimension of information or direct contact with reality. So I guess that's all I got for now. There are other questions. Yeah. Those are my overriding ones. Thanks.
So I'll start from the first question. Why don't they just, come out and rule the rooster and set it up the way they want, if they have the power to do so and they are from here or they are invested in this planet in some way? We can have some clues about it if we observe our own behavior towards what we consider inferior life. Look at wildlife researchers. They operate according to a certain code of ethics based on non-interference. Even anthropologists, when they are studying human groups that are pre-literate, they have the same code of conduct. They do not interfere.
But that's for a different reason, though. That's not, sorry to interrupt. That's not necessarily, certainly not always for ethical reasons. That's because it's recognized that if you interfere personally, you're not going to get a clear reading on how these animals naturally are, because now they're relating to us. So you need a certain distance that way. But I mean, we can see as humans that we're not all about just treating animals well, just animals for medical research or cosmetic research alone. I don't think they're trying to rule a roost necessarily, but I'm not sure that, we have this idea of the, what's it called? It's the principle of non-interference. There's a name for it. The
prime directive.
The prime directive. I think we're that's in the back of our mind. We just assume that would be true, but I don't know.
It is a possibility. And
certainly it's a possibility.
And it's a reasonable one, grounded in our own behavior. I think there is more to our non-interference approach in wildlife research and anthropology than just sort of fouling the experiment. I think there are morals and ethics entailed in that as well. What we consider to be correct or inadequate play a role, regardless of the practical objectives of the experiment. So I think that's one thing to consider. Maybe they have something analogous to it, and they are going to let the monkeys run amok on the roof until the monkeys risk setting the house on fire. And the fact that they seem to be following our dangerous activities seem to suggest that yes, they will leave us alone up to a point when it starts interfering with them. And we don't know what's going to happen at that point, because we are yet to try to destroy ourselves. So we are doing our best, but we didn't get to the threshold yet. So what would happen if a crazy somewhere in Russia decided to fire nukes? What would happen? Would they interfere? Have they interfered? If they have, we wouldn't know, would we? Because there would be incredibly valid national security reasons not to make it public if certain things stopped working the moment you pressed the button. So I think that's a reasonable possibility grounded in our own behavior that may account for this. Let me speak to this a little more. Even if they are not from here, if they are from here and they have the ability to go anywhere else, your question was, why do they care? Well, I think all of us would always care about the ancestral home. We would always be invested in that which was our origin. Even if we have developed the ability to colonize the solar system or the galaxy, home is home, and there would be a psychological investment in that, I think. Another possibility is, what if they are not from here? Why would they be invested then? Why do they care? Why don't they just, change everything according to their liking, which was your question?
That wasn't exactly my question, but I'll let you run with it.
Okay. Why don't they set things up in a different way as per their priorities, if they have the power to do that? And they are not from here. Why don't they do that? One possibility, and again, now I'm stretching beyond what is in the article, so I'm entertaining more, giving myself a little more latitude here. What would we do if we had set up a planetary level experiment? We would be invested in running that experiment with as little interference as possible, because interference ruins the experiment. It fouls the whole thing. And some experiments are very long term. We do that in human health research. The longest experiment we have run so far is 90 years. We have followed 3 generations, their life habits and the impact it has on their metabolism, their survival chances, and so on. Could there be a planetary level experiment at geological scales of time? There could be. And if it is their experiment, and then obviously they are invested, they will monitor it. That's what you do with an experiment. You keep measuring over time, you keep monitoring, you keep checking what's going on, and you try to interfere as little as possible. Occasionally, maybe you make a little course correction here or there when things are really going out of bound. But beyond these little adjustments, you want to keep your hands off as much as possible, and you would be invested in that experiment. So this is a scenario where they aren't from another planet necessarily. It might be, but not necessarily, and which would keep them engaged. The argument against it is that the level of monitoring seems to be vastly excessive. We could monitor a variety of parameters in another planet with a few orbiting probes, and we would know what we want to know. The counter argument against this is that we are only imagining the parameters that we would like to measure. They may have a view of reality and an understanding of the dynamics of nature that requires the monitoring of many, 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 many more parameters over a much longer stretch of time to conclude what they're trying to conclude. And therefore, from their perspective, they do need much more intensive monitoring than we would need, because of our sort of tunnel vision about the variables at play here. Under that hypothesis, they would be monitoring us, and they would not interfere unless absolutely necessary, because that ruins the experiment. Could humanity be part of that experiment? Goodness knows, there are some reasons to think that. I'll tell you one. One of the greatest, maybe the greatest mystery in paleoanthropology is why and how we came up with symbolic thinking. Because anatomically, we have existed as modern humans for 200,000, maybe 300,000 years. It's the blink of an eye, but say 300,000 years. Whatever genetic mutations we have had that have a phenotypical impact, we have had them already 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. But there is only evidence of our ability to think symbolically. In other words, conceptually, to use language, to replace the elements of nature with linguistic concepts and work out models in our own minds using those concepts before applying them externally to the world. This is a phenomenal intellectual capacity. It is the greatest change in the history of life, because it allowed one species to completely unplug from the web of instinct and take direct metacognitive, explicit control of its actions, as opposed to instinctual action. That is an enormous gamble by nature on this planet, because it gave us the Promethean power of fire, stolen from the gods. It runs the risk of completely upsetting the balance that is built into the web of instinct, which, sure enough, is exactly what we've been doing. So the most consequential genetic mutation in the history of life on Earth happened with no survival or fitness advantages at first, because it must have happened 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. And we didn't use this capability for another 150,000 years. At least it's a capability that lay dormant for a very long time. Therefore, it was affixed in our genome for no reason. Now think about this. There are things that happen casually in evolution. Some features that are just side effects of other gains of certain genetic mutations. There is even a name for those. But here we are talking about the most spectacular and consequential genetic mutation in the history of life. And as far as we know, it happened for precisely no reason and lay dormant for 150,000 years until its possessor suddenly discovered that it was there. Ian Tattersall, who used to be the curator of the Hall of Human History in the American Museum of Natural History, an extremely recognized academic, Ian Tattersall is his name. In his book from 2012 called Masters of the Planet, he says, the only reason we have to believe that something like this could have ever happened is that it obviously did. Otherwise, we would absolutely discard this as completely baloney, completely implausible, not worthy of entertaining. So this is one of the great mysteries about us. And it's difficult if you're interested in that, like I am, and I read about that. And then I'm interested in what has been going on in the UAP world, at least since 2017. And this behavior of the UAPs that seems so invested in us and what we are doing, it's difficult not to start fantasizing about certain connections and certain links, which could theoretically, I'm not proposing this, I'm not defending what I'm suggesting here, I'm just bringing it up loosely as sort of thought candy. That's what I'm doing. If that leap in our history was part of their experiment, you bet they would be invested and they would be monitoring. They want to see the experiment unfold without messing up with it more than they need to be, beyond setting up certain experimental conditions. That would account for a lot of things. Why don't I take this too seriously? It's because we have zero positive evidence for any of what I just said. So no, we shouldn't run with it because it's pure fantasy at this point.
Thank you very much for that. See, I share for what it's worth.
Say it again?
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. That's a fantasy that I happen to share.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Samantha?
Hi. Yeah, more on this topic of ecology and NHI communication. Just to follow up on what Mark had said, I'm a sociologist, and my entire career has been looking at environmental issues. So I am of the position right now that humanity, and specifically Western humanity, is stuck in its response or lack of ability to mount global responses to climate change and other ecological threats. We know what to do. We're not doing it. And these are questions of collective action. They're questions of political economy. And, they have a lot of social explanations. But given that, and the fact that non-human intelligences have been giving Western humans warning messages about both nuclear but also ecological issues since my research finds back to the 1920s in a Western context, it may be even earlier. Why are they doing this? Because to follow with some of your analogies, if this is an experiment, saying to selected members of the experimental group, well, what's going to happen. It's going to be bad, but not really saying much more than that, which I'm basically reducing a lot of this communication to various forms of this, or saying things that are considered platitudes amongst humans, right? We need to take care of the environment better and care about each other and the planet. Yeah, we all know that. So I guess one of my questions for you, over and above what you've said, is it useful for social scientists to be looking at the content of this communication as if it could be something useful to communicate to human beings today?
I think, if I remember the books by John Mack, where he wrote extensively about this, the alien abduction phenomenon and the messages that we have to take care of the planet and the environment, that seems to be correlated mainly with the abduction phenomenon, which I think is mostly psychological. I'm not saying that it's prosaic or trivial. I think it is profound and reveals more about the scope and breadth and depth of human nature than we dare to contemplate right now. So it is profound, but it has a fundamentally mental reality, I think. If that's where these messages are happening, mostly, that could be us talking to ourselves. A part of our minds that is deeper in, dissociated from the ego, that picks things intuitively up and tries to communicate with the executive ego in its symbolic form, because that's how the layers of the psyche communicate with one another. We have known that since Freud and Jung over 100 years ago. So that could be us talking to ourselves, or a collective us talking to individual ones of ourselves. Insofar as these messages come from the sort of nuts and bolts aspect of the phenomenon, I don't know of any case in which this is unambiguously the case, but let's imagine that there is a case or a few cases in which a measurable phenomenon, we have radar traces, we have film or CCD camera images and whatever other measurements and physical footprints, and there is a communication like that. I think the least likely hypothesis is that what they are communicating is meant at face value. Because if that's their goal, if they're telling us, no, you really should save your planet, well, if that's the goal, they can solve it very quickly. Land in the White House lawn, show their measurements and their studies and their projections, and tell us that they know better and we are going to screw up the whole thing, and that's the end of the story. So why don't they do that? Well, obviously, the intent is not what it seems to be if you take the message at face value. Something else is going on. We have to look deeper into this, like Michael did earlier today. Don't take it at face value, because the logical implication of taking it at face value is that they would be doing some other things that they are not. So it's not, the message is not what it seems. It's more along the lines of, I think that's my personal opinion, along the lines of Jacques' control system, which plays with multiple layers of meaning, plays with our psyche at multiple layers of meaning. It is not really what it seems to be. It may not be malicious. It may be an artifact of two cognitive systems that are not aligned with one another, that do not have direct correspondences to one another, trying to interact with one another. And then you get this kind of oddities where things are not what they seem. And that may be a very much a good faith effort. It doesn't need to be malicious or deceptive, although I put my chips on it being manipulative. Not for a bad reason, not with a bad intent, but manipulative in the sense that it's a deliberate attempt to have a certain effect. That is not what it seems to be. My chips would go with that.
If I can just jump in really quickly, one other option that I think is worth considering, or maybe it's not an option, but a lot of these questions about why certain messages are communicated make the presumption that communication or information that seems to be transmitted must be intentional in nature. But you can imagine lots of ways of configuring minds in which information transfer doesn't have to require an intent on the outside. Like, just for example, octopuses emote visibly without any ability to hide it or whatever. You just octopuses automatically know what everybody's feeling, and there's no intention required. You can imagine minds where information works in that way, and then we walk away saying, well, why did they communicate that to me? But we're making the mistaken presumption that whatever we walked away with must have been a thing that was selected by some other mind and then put forward, but it might just be the only thing that we could comprehend, or it might be, you know, some mirror reflection
Leakage.
of leakage, or all sorts of other metaphors you can throw at it.
Yeah, I think that's eminently coherent. I am with you on that.
Christian, do you want to jump in?
Thank you. I do. I try to make that quick. Firstly, I wanted to also cheer you. I wanted to thank you for this incredibly fruitful discussion we're having, and I think we're taking a lot of potential avenues to further investigate back home. I also wanted to congratulate you for being one of the last metaphysicians. I appreciate your philosophical work, and if we had the time, I would really love to hear you know, a study of UAP as seen from a radical idealism perspective. But if you allow me, I would like to make an observation on the discussion we're having here today. And I've been trying to understand. I think there is, in the way that we've talked about things and you've presented your argument, I see some sort of a strategic concern when it comes to the communication of the topic and the something that you could call a normalization of the UAP, plus all that could be once we give ourselves, as you often called it, the latitude to consider certain aspects that might be much more revolutionary for a lot of the paradigms that we're dealing with in social sciences as well as in the natural sciences. I find that firstly, I wanted to ask if that is you know, the right answer, because we literally have not talked about the Silurian hypothesis yet in this round, but everybody jumped into, you know, the very interesting aspects that you were opening, that we might be faced with an otherness that is so different on so many levels, maybe given as a function of time, maybe given as a function of the natural environment of the other, that, you know, the intelligences that would, you know, be confronted with each other probably don't have the grounds to communicate, because those grounds need to have a grounding in a physical reality that is not given in the other case. So the question that I have is, Bernardo, how would you recommend the Society for UAP Studies to have some sort of an escalation plan in the way that they're getting closer to the real questions? And I was, you know, I was deeply inspired by the way that you've been, just within 2 minutes, you've been turning upside down, you know, saying that maybe we should take a step back from material reductionism and probably think it the other way around. I mean, that's what probably an idealist would say. You know, try to take that into consideration, that the way that things are created is not what your physics teacher has told you for most of the time. So do you have something like a plan? Do you think that this will unfold in itself? And you know, in a way, what would be the recommendations that you would give, if you would give any? Thank you so much.
I don't have a plan. I wish I had. I'm not sure a plan is even possible at this stage. The reason I think we didn't discuss much about the Silurian hypothesis, other than the 20 minutes I spoke about it in the beginning, is that it's already there in the essay. So, you know, are we going to just rehash stuff that is out there? I thought you guys want to, you know, explore a little further. It was not premeditated, or it doesn't have any, I don't have any hidden agenda about expanding beyond the Silurian hypothesis. But you are correct that I am careful about publicly talking of other hypotheses that require many more jumps, many more assumptions, many more theoretical entities. I'm careful about that because when it comes to this particular topic, it You know how neurotransmitters work? Certain neurotransmitters only lock into certain types of receptors and not others. If we have receptors for religion, which we obviously do because the religious impulse is universal. To this day, it's universal. The human search for transcendent meaning has been universal throughout history, and it's intact today. So metaphorically, if we have receptors for religion neurotransmitters, the UAP neurotransmitters lock right into those receptors. And that's good and dangerous at the same time. It's good because the interest in the topic is automatic, it's inborn. Most people are interested in it at one level or another, even if they don't admit to themselves that they are. But the danger is that we get carried away. And goodness knows there's plenty of getting carried away in the UFO UAP community. It's sort of getting better now, but it has been close to madness at some points. That's why I'm careful. I don't want to stimulate too much that getting carried away, especially now that things seem to be taking a turn for the better. You know what I mean? So I try to remain cognizant of whatever effect I have in the cultural dialogue. It's minor, whatever it is, because I'm a minor figure. So that helps me to sleep better. But even as a minor figure, if I have any effect at all, I try to be responsible and not allow that effect to be something I don't intend. As for a plan, I think the critical limitation we have right now is not even our monkey cognitive system. Goodness knows that's a major limitation, but it's not even operationally speaking the main limitation right now. The main limitation right now is we do not have the data. Maybe some people do, and maybe, and I believe they do have excellent reasons not to make the data generally available, because in a democracy, whatever you tell your people, you tell your enemies. Let's not forget that. That's the nature of a democracy. And a democracy is great. It's the best system of government we have ever had. But we have to make sure to remain aware of its weaknesses. As any system of government, it's a compromise. It's the best compromise, but it's still a compromise. And one of its weaknesses is that whatever you tell your people, you're telling your enemies. There is just no way around it. So there may be good reasons for the data to be kept under lock and key, but that doesn't change the fact that we don't have the data. And the people who have the data, for excellent reasons, again, it's not a criticism, but it so happens that they are the people who are probably charged with creating weapons, not necessarily the people who have the background, who have the neuronal structure to take 10 steps back and contemplate it with fresh eyes, informed by a number of different fields, based on whatever scientific understanding we have, based on whatever philosophical understanding we have about the nature of reality. Of course, they are not in the position to do that. Why would they be? It's not their job. And yet, for very good reasons, they may be the only ones with the data. So we have an impasse here. And the solution for it is not to destroy democracy, and it's not to leak to our opposition, interested in destroying our way of life, like certainly Russia is, and most likely is China as well. We don't want to hand them, a birthday cake or a gun that will immediately turn back on us. So I'm sensitive to all this, but none of it changes the fact that we don't have the data. And that is the key limitation. Without the data, can we even plan? On the basis of what are we going to plan? Fantasy? Hypothesizing? Theoretical creativity? All of this is good. The imagination is good. Without imagination, no science. But there is only so far you can healthily pursue them without being every now and then sort of doing a course correction based on the data. Not so you don't go off on a tangent and lose yourself, go off to the races, and you never return from that because you're not being grounded in data, because the data is not there. Even if you wanted to ground yourself in data, the data is not there. So how do we make a plan? And I would be much more involved in the UAP field if there were more data. I found myself in the position of having been heavily involved at it at second half of last year. But I realized that it wasn't productive. It wasn't the most productive use of my time, given that I am a philosopher. I know people like Kevin, physicists, now they are swimming in their own pool here. As a philosopher and a computer scientist, there's only so far I can go without sort of grounding myself empirically in reliable data and whatever regularities of the phenomena are there. I'll give you a quick example. If, as I believe is the case, because I believe David Grush was telling the truth, if it is the case that we have biologicals in freezers, we can immediately sort out the question, are they terrestrial or not? If they have the same biochemistry we have, the chances that they are not terrestrial are like vanishingly small, because even on Earth, our biochemistry could have been very different. It's a multi-instantiatable problem, so to say. So you get that answer immediately. I'll tell you another thing. If it turns out, as rumors indicate, that the biologicals are artificial, that they do not have fully developed digestive systems, that they cannot survive disconnected from their craft, that they are essentially biological AIs, that would be fascinating from a philosophical perspective, because what it's telling us is biology is needed. You cannot sort it out through silicon or sapphire and metals and all the good stuff that we use to perform computations in a way much more efficient than our brain does. What else do we know? We know that individuated consciousness correlates one-to-one with biology. So why do they need biology? Is this some kind of, is that artificial biological avatar receptacle of consciousness? Is this the case that telepathy only works with biology? And therefore, if you want to enter a different reality, so to say, you need an entity that has its existence rooted in that reality, but is biological. So some kind of signal can be exchanged through it. Some sort of remote control could be. I mean, I'm fantasizing. I'm going off to the races here, but I'm just trying to fantasize about examples of how we could have a plan if we had access to the data. And without access to the data, everything I just said is just fantasy. It has zero value. And then we can, people like me, and I don't have the access Gary Nolan has and Kevin has to put things under a SEM, scanning electron microscope, or do metallurgical analysis. So people like me, very quickly, in 6 months, I reached the end of the road. And I know that going beyond that, maybe it would give me some best-selling books, but I'm not interested in that. I would just be fantasizing. And that doesn't turn my diamond on. I will not leave my bed in the morning to write a book that's just pure fantasy. It's not my thing. Doesn't matter how much money I could make out of it. By the way, I don't need much money. So yeah, for me, there is no plan. I think people like Gary, people like Kevin, Jacques, with the access they have and the specialties they have, they could have a plan. Yes, they could look at, are we talking about waveguides here at the terahertz level? Can we look into this? If that's the case, who has terahertz waveguides in the world today? Well, the American military. That's about it. Nobody else has that. Are we talking about some kind of molecular level 3D printing technology? They can look into that. They can look at the statistical distribution of impurities in materials, and that can tell you whether we are talking about a 3D printing technology or not. If I am a biologist and I have access to tissue samples, well, it's a party. I can give you a plan for the next 10 years. But where I am, I can think about it for 6 months and move on to something else where I can make a valuable contribution. So that's my dilemma. I can't give you a plan. Maybe Kevin can give you a plan. I believe Kevin has a plan. He has had a plan for 20 years, I think. Thank you.
I don't exactly have a plan, I don't think. I have a strategy for trying to pin down some of the physical characteristics of these craft. That's basically it. What you've done in this essay is really commendable, and I was really excited to read it. And you've taken this paucity of data that we have, and you've extracted some very important key elements from it, which I think is really important. One of the most insightful is the fact that they come from here. And I think that's an important insight that that has actually led a lot of scientists astray early on. Carl Sagan, in fact, had said that he had a hard time imagining that you had an interstellar craft arriving at Earth every 2 weeks. And he was absolutely right. That would be hard to imagine, just like you said, to see what 3 million encounters in 20 years, 150,000 a year or something. That's hard to imagine if they're coming from interstellar space. So, I wish Carl was still here, because I have a great respect for the man, and I would love to grab him by the shoulder and say, yes, you've almost got it. One more step. They're not coming from interstellar space. They're coming from here. And that's clear. And there's other evidence of that as well that you didn't mention in the essay, or I didn't pick up on that in the essay. The fact that they show up at natural disasters within 24 hours. So the Fukushima nuclear power plant, when it was damaged during the tsunami, the next day there were UFOs there. I mean, that puts their distance from Earth a half light day away, to use a strange unit of distance, right? So they can't possibly be coming from more than a half light day away. Well, what's within a half light day of Earth or solar system? It's basically just our solar system.
Yeah.
They're clearly coming from within our solar system. You can rule that out. And the Russian military Yeremenkov, I think, had said that they used to do troop movements, or ship movements to lure UFOs in to study them. And they would arrive within 24 hours. So it's clear they're coming from Earth. And I think that's an important thing to highlight at this point. It's not just, we don't have someone visiting. They're not visitors. They live here. They're residents. And it's and that's important. We share this planet with somebody else. And we don't know anything about them, and I think that's an important realization, and it changes the whole game. It really does. I think that's an important insight. Now then comes the next question, which does lead to the Silurian hypothesis, which I always think the name is quite funny, especially since you were talking about the Carboniferous era and oil. Or natural, or petrochemicals, because the Silurian period was before the Carboniferous period. But so it's kind of funny to think about that way. But maybe more appropriate, because UFOs are related to the ocean, and the Silurian period was when we had life in our oceans. So maybe that actually is more appropriate. But so the question is, who are they? And where are they from originally, and all of this? And I think that's a very important question, and a very interesting question. Did they evolve here on Earth with us or before us? And I think that's entirely reasonable hypothesis. And I agree that is probably the simplest hypothesis. The other hypothesis I've entertained is the fact that they're extraterrestrial and discovered Earth at some point, and basically set up some kind of presence here. And I recently was at an astronomy conference in Durham, England, where I presented simulations of galactic colonization. And basically, I simulated 1 million civilizations that are basically colonizing other nearby star systems and growing out. And I kept track of the ones that found Earth so that I could do statistics on what civilization characteristics you need to be able to find Earth, so that we can, and the idea was to work this out using known physics, so that we basically are using our current knowledge of physics to inform what our prior beliefs ought to be about interstellar colonization. Because when you talk to physicists and astronomers about interstellar travel and this, you get wildly different views that really aren't based on their knowledge of physics. So the idea here was to basically do simulations to see what we ought to be believing. And I found some interesting things, and perhaps the most interesting was that if there is someone active, if you have an extraterrestrial presence active here on Earth today, then on average, they probably found Earth about 250,000 years ago.
Interesting.
And that's what the simulations tell you, which is amazing. It tells you that they've been here the whole time, throughout human history, which matches our data. But it now lends itself to being a competitor hypothesis with the Silurian hypothesis, right? They've been here the whole time. They've been here the long, and I think that not necessarily the speeds that we have measured UAP to travel at, those are spacecraft speeds, but I think that the top speeds that have been measured are on the order of usually around 40,000 miles an hour. There was one case where it's up to 250,000 miles an hour. These are incredible speeds, but not fast enough for interstellar travel. However, the accelerations do lend themselves to interstellar travel. So, for example, in the Nimitz case, we estimated the acceleration of the Tic Tacs to be up to 5,000 Gs. And a 1,000 G acceleration, if you can sustain that in space for a period of time, you can get up to 90% the speed of light in about 17 hours. So that puts you into the accelerations of the UAP suggest that they are possibly interstellar craft or capable of interstellar travel. That doesn't mean that they're traveling that they're actually doing it all the time. And I often joke that, when skeptics say, why does everybody always assume these things are spacecraft? And I now say, well, we have enough data now that the reason we think there might be spacecraft is because they go as fast as spacecraft go. And that's really true. So this is the only other piece of evidence that to me suggests that they could be extraterrestrial. The fact that their craft appear to have at least the accelerations that would put them in the class of being interstellar capable.
Yeah, I think what is clear is that they are invested in here. They are invested in us, the Earth.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's important. And if they had discovered Earth, 250,000 years ago, in their minds, Earth is their planet. They found it. This is the typical colonization mentality that we're now trying to get rid of, throughout the world, yeah. Right? But we might be looking at the business end of this problem, and the whole planet might be looking at the business end of this problem in a galactic scale, which is different. And it could very well be that they've been here throughout human history. They don't have a large presence here. It's large enough that we've now we can detect them and we know they're here, but they're not easily detectable. They don't have factories and cities and all of this that are easily found. But they could be very well invested in the planet. It's their planet after all, right? And so you could imagine that we haven't had that much interaction with them. They haven't worried too much about the crazy monkeys until around 1945, when those crazy monkeys became a danger to their planet. And then now you see that now there's a potential for conflict, which has me a bit worried, because one of the concerns with them being extraterrestrial has always been, well, if they wanted to take over the planet, they would have done it already. Well, that's not. They already live here. They've been living here for 250,000 years. So that's already all happened. But the conflict could actually come about from humans being a danger to their planet, and a planet that they care about. And that's so there could be an oncoming conflict. And one of the recent Senate, I think it was when Gillibrand had helped, Senator Gillibrand had put in legislation to form the UAP task force and all of this. I think it was in that, but some of the wording was that they have been becoming exponentially more aggressive. I think that was the phrase that was used in the report in Congress. And that's what you hear from the pilots that were engaged with them on the USS Roosevelt in the Persian Gulf. These objects were flying at the planes as we were doing bombing runs in Syria. And that was happening in 2015, which is really what instigated the Navy getting involved. This was a big problem because you've got pilots flying into a war zone who have to first encounter UFOs, aggressive UFOs, before they get to the war zone. So in one case, Lou Elizondo told me personally, said that in one case, the object came and flew at the plane and did barrel rolls around the cockpit and then took off. That's going to really, mess with a pilot and cause a lot of trouble. So are they trying to get us not to fight? Maybe. And, it is a lot more aggressive than what we saw with the Foo Fighters in the early 1940s, when they would just fly along with the planes right off the wingtips in some cases. So, and is landing on the White House lawn going to work? Probably not. You could present the White House with all of the data you wanted on climate change, and nobody's going to agree to do anything. That's been attempted. I mean, Al Gore has been talking about climate change since 1988. And it's taken us, how many, that's 30 years ago. We knew about climate was a problem 30 years ago. That was Al Gore. And, that's one of the things that contributed him not getting elected as president. So humans aren't going to listen to these issues. And so it has me a bit concerned. What are they going to do when they decide that this has gone too far?
Yeah, I think what is unquestionable is that they are invested. The simpler hypothesis to account for it is that, they are terrestrial. They're invested because they are from here. Another one is the one you brought up. They are not from here, but they became from here because they colonized us or became marooned here or whatever. And that's operationally indistinguishable from their being from here. Now they are from here. And the third one is here is an experiment they set up, and they are invested because it's their experiment. And they have to play then that game of, we can't interfere too much because that will foul the experiment. But we can't let the monkeys ruin the experiment either. So you have to do a little bit, but not too much. And this is consistent with what we see. Interference, but restrained interference. How do you stop the bacteria on the Petri dish from running amok without ruining the experiment by interfering with the results? So yeah, I think that's coherent too, although it's too far out at this point. We shouldn't entertain number 3 hypothesis yet.
Yeah, I think that saying they're invested, they live here and they're invested is perfectly reasonable. And I think that's a good place to stop at this point, hypothesis wise, and say this much we can be certain about. And
yeah,
it makes this a much more important problem. I think that this, in my opinion, the UAP problem is the biggest problem humans face right now. Number one. we have a lot to worry about, and I know nobody else wants another thing to worry about, but I think this is the biggest problem.
Okay. With that, perhaps we can actually end. I know it's a bit of a low note, Kevin.
No, I don't want to leave. I mean, but it's an exciting problem. I mean, we're
Yeah,
about
very.
to encounter a new society, a new civilization, perhaps a new species, and we're all going to learn new things. And there's all sorts of great possibilities ahead as well, as long as we humans can get over ourselves and do what we ought to be doing rather than what we want to be doing.
Michael, do you have any final thoughts?
The one thought that I contemplated interjecting at the end is that I sometimes worry that this line of thinking, that that whatever it is behind UAP is interventionist to a degree to keep us from ruining the experiment. I worry that type of thinking, if it takes hold at a larger scale, will be used to excuse just rampant disregard for the problems of the environment or whatever, simply out of some faith that if it gets too bad, they'll intervene and stop it. I would think that's too silly of a frame of mind to actually become popular, but that's me. Too much confidence in what sorts of frameworks can become really rampant. But maybe it's true, though. Maybe it just does fall out of this kind of way of thinking, but I certainly hope not. I think there's a lot more positive thoughts and implications of all these than just the sort of disastrous or melancholic ones. But thank you for having us talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I know, Christian, you had your hand up briefly. If you wanted to give a final thought, if you're still with us. Yeah.
I am. It's a question of understanding. Michael, I thought your last comment was really good. I think that needs to be concerned, and that's the good thing about having social scientists on board, because that's literally where we can start those surveys already and look at people's reaction about the idea of being part of an experiment. I think catastrophic disclosure would be the understatement of the century, if that would be the case, with the consequences. But Kevin, I just wanted to ask you again, you said the UFO problem, or the UAP problem, are you talking about the scientific problem of not having a solution to a phenomenon that is observed, or are you normatively saying that the UAP could be a problem with regard to that we go too far with, killing biodiversity, and that would be a major intervention at one point, or is it both?
Well, I think it's kind of both. I mean, they are clearly far more technologically advanced than we are, and it really hints to the fact that we don't really understand physics very well at all, even though we like to think we do. And yet at the same time, as Bernardo has pointed out very well, they're clearly invested in this planet, and intention is, when you're dealing with intelligent beings, intention's everything. So we don't know their intentions, and we don't know what the bigger story is. We're discovering we're part of a bigger picture, and we don't know what that picture even looks like. And I think that's the big problem. There's a much bigger story here, which in some ways is fantastic, but it's a little scary. We're going to have to change how we think about ourselves. We have to change how we think about the world and our place in it. And it's going to be new and different.
Guys, I need to leave. I'm 3 minutes late for the next thing.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of the Society for UAP Studies, Bernardo. Thank you so much. Hopefully we will see you and interact with you more in the future. Good night. Good luck. Thank you, everyone. I will bring the meeting to a close. Thank you so much. Thanks, care, everybody.
Thanks,
you. Kevin. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.
Yep.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you so much.